All the characters in the story are over 18. At 20, I met John, who was a few years older than me. We looked like a strange couple on the outside. A tall, plump girl, 2 heads taller than her skinny but mobile boyfriend. But this didn't bother us at all. Our relationship was developing rapidly, and it seemed to me that things were getting closer to a wedding. When I was 20, I met John. He was a few years older than me. We didn't look like a typical couple on the outside. I was tall and plump, and he was 2 heads taller than me, but still pretty mobile. But that didn't bother us at all. Our relationship was moving along quickly, and it seemed like we were getting closer to getting married. But then, when we had sex, John tried to convince me to get an abortion. I was totally against it. He said he'd leave me if I didn't. I didn't want to break up with him, so I told him not to rush into it. But I didn't agree to get an abortion either. In the end, John left. We didn't get married. But as expected, 9 months later, I had a boy. I named him Michael, after my dad. My mom and dad had died by that time. We got pregnant right after we started dating. John wanted me to get an abortion, but I was dead set against it. He said he'd leave me if I didn't, and I told him not to, but I didn't want to get an abortion either. So, John left, and we didn't get married. 9 months later, I had a boy, and I named him Michael, after my dad. My parents had died by then, and my 2 sisters had moved to other cities. I raised Michael by myself, because I thought it was important. He grew up to be sociable, smart, handsome, kind, and athletic, just like his dad, who unfortunately wasn't around when Michael was 6. Then, there was a big problem. Michael was in a bad car accident when he was 6, and the doctors said he might not survive. He was alive, but he had a severe spinal injury and was disabled. At first, the doctors tried to help him, but they eventually said there was nothing more they could do. They said he wasn't going to make it. I asked the doctor, "Is my son really hopeless?" The doctor said, "Honestly, I don't think there's anything else we can do for him." The doctor, who had a lot of gray hair, looked at me thoughtfully. According to the stats, every 6th person who has a spinal injury dies in the first days and weeks after it. You mean I interrupted? Startled?
Nah.
He put me in the middle and, after a pause, said decisively, "There's nothing more we can do to help him." "Sorry, but of course." I began timidly. But the doctor cut me off with a gesture. "Get this straight. Your kid's biggest wish is going to be key. You're going to have to put in a ton of effort and be super patient in the fight to save your boy and bring him back to his family and friends. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You're in a bad spot, but there's a chance to get out of it. Be ready for a long road ahead." The doctor cut me off with a gesture. "You need to understand that your child really wants this, and you're going to have to put in a lot of effort and be super patient to help your son get back with his family and friends. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You're in a tough spot, but there's hope. Be prepared for some long-term challenges ahead. It might take years to see any progress." Before I left, he gave me some books and told me to follow their advice. I was really grateful because our doctors usually aren't very open about answering tough questions. At the time, I had no idea how serious things were or what challenges were coming. I had a feeling, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I hoped Michael would lie down for a week or 2, or at least a month or 2, and then get up and run as if nothing had happened. If only that were possible, but after returning home, the problems started immediately. A walk, which was a natural need, turned out to be a luxury for Michael. Then, we lived on the 14th floor of a new building, the doors and stairs of which did not allow one person to take out a stroller. 2 people were needed. Ideally, they'd be strong. But where could I find them? I had to literally carry my son in my arms. Thankfully, Michael took after his puny father and not me, the lady in the body. It was urgent to find a new, more comfortable apartment, which fortunately was quickly found. The move was uneventful, the new apartment was smaller, but most importantly, it was on the ground floor, and it was more convenient to go outside with my son than at my previous place. However, it was necessary to slightly rebuild it to meet his son's needs. When exchanging apartments, I even managed to earn a little money. This money was a gift of fate, as it was sorely lacking. Unfortunately, they all want to pay for the relocation and modeling of a new apartment. To the credit of John Michael's father, when he found out about our situation, he started sending me some money. At first, I wanted to send it back, but then I decided not to. It was really helpful. Unfortunately, after my son turned 18, the money stopped coming after the car accident. My son stayed the same, smart, handsome, and kind, but he had no one to talk to except for some people sometimes. He found out about our problems and sent me some money every now and then. At first, I wanted to send it back, but then I decided not to. They were really useful to us. Unfortunately, after his son turned 18, the money transfer stopped. After the car accident, my son stayed the same, smart, handsome, and kind, but he had no one to talk to except for some of the time. At first, I tried to bring the neighborhood kids, his peers, to him, but he asked me not to bring anyone else because he was seeing pity and sometimes disgust in their eyes. So, his social circle was really limited, which made him look depressed. So, when talking with my son, I always tried to stay cheerful and positive because I was afraid he would become depressed. A disabled person's worst enemy is at first, I tried to bring the neighborhood kids to him, but he saw pity and sometimes disgust in their eyes, so he asked me not to bring anyone else. This made his social circle pretty narrow, and he looked depressed. So, when talking with my son, I always tried to stay cheerful because I was afraid he would become depressed. In the new apartment, I slept in the same bed with my son, afraid to leave him alone. I even washed him, since he couldn't wash himself. I didn't even know how many problems a disabled person has. A spinal injury causes immobility, loss of sensitivity, and problems with the work of internal organs. Most importantly, it was impossible to allow pressure sores to appear, which is a form of necrosis. Bed sores are a real problem for disabled people. They're dangerous because they can appear suddenly and have really bad consequences. It's no surprise that tens of thousands of disabled people die every year from these sores. Once a sore appears in one place, it can spread to other places, and it can make it hard to move around. Bed sores are sneaky. They come out of nowhere and can be really bad. They're a big reason why disabled people with spinal injuries die. It's scary because they can pop up anywhere and they're really bad. They can even lead to other problems like osteomyelitis. I had to remember all this stuff and try to prevent it. I had to stay hopeful and believe that my son could get better. I taught him to be independent, to keep learning, and to always try to do his best. She's always encouraged him to be independent and to keep learning. I've always wanted him to be self-sufficient and not dependent on others. But recently, I noticed that my son was watching me with interest. At first, I thought I imagined it, but after thinking about it, I realized that she made some improvements. She made him more independent and active and less dependent. One day, I noticed that my son was watching me. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then I realized that he was actually interested. I thought, well, this is something a woman my age might be interested in, especially if she hasn't had a man in a while. So I gave him all the details. I answered all his questions in detail, and she showed him how everything works for a woman. A few days later, I woke up to Michael screaming. I pulled back the blanket and examined him as usual. I must have had a terrible dream. The next day, I reread all the literature I could find. There was practically no information on the issue of interest. A few days later, on one of the long evenings, I was sitting on my son's bed, sewing up some torn socks. Michael was watching a movie on TV. He turned his head to the wall, his eyes were moist, and he sighed heavily. I realized that he feels disconnected from the society of healthy people and peers on the street. It's difficult for a healthy person to understand the full drama of the situation when a young, Michael was sitting on my son's bed, sewing up torn socks. He was watching a movie on TV, but he kept turning his head to the wall. His eyes were all moist. He sighed a lot. I realized that he feels disconnected from the society of healthy people and peers on the street. It's hard for a healthy person to understand the full drama of the situation when a young, full-fledged guy can't find a girlfriend simply because he doesn't leave home. When he is taken out in a wheelchair into the yard, nothing changes fundamentally. After all, he can't invite a girl he likes to a disco, a movie, or a cafe. All that a healthy guy can do without difficulty is an insurmountable obstacle for a disabled person. Several months have passed, and nothing remarkable has happened. I could feel that he was worried about something, but he didn't want to talk about it. Gradually, his son's mood began to deteriorate. He ate without appetite and became apathetic. He was kind of irritable, and he did some kind of therapy that made him feel pretty bad. He got really down and didn't want to do anything. Eventually, he just stopped trying to improve himself and got pretty hardened. We'd talk, and it'd end in an argument. In the morning, he'd turn on the TV and just sit there all day, not even leaving the room. Over the past 11 years, I've seen a lot of people with disabilities, and I knew depression could lead to some really sad outcomes. I was really worried, but I hoped that my son's birthday would be better. It would help change the situation for the better. My son just turned 18. We were sitting at the table on his bed, and next to it on 2 stools were dishes and a bottle of red wine. I'm wearing my best dress. From the outside, it might seem that we were my son's birthday was, and he turned 18. We were at the table in his room, and next to it on 2 stools were dishes and a bottle of red wine. I was wearing my best dress, and it might have looked like we were having fun, but I felt like my son was only pretending to be having fun. He seemed stressed by the conversation, but he didn't want to offend me, so he kept the conversation going. We drank red wine to improve his health and get well soon. Our conversation flowed slowly. We were having a casual chat over some red wine to help my son feel better. We went through the usual stuff. "Michael, what's been bothering you lately? Why have you been so grumpy?" I suddenly asked my son. "I'm not sure girls will be into me." The guy answered thoughtfully, looking down. "They probably don't see me as a guy." "It's not like that." I cut in. "Look, when it comes to women, it's not about how strong you are. It's about being kind, smart, and strong. Women are not into big muscles. What they really like is a strong spirit. Nothing makes a woman happier than a man's self-dash. He's got the confidence to get out of any situation, even the toughest ones. She'll feel safe with him, and women like having an optimistic guy by their side, not a loser. She'll be happy with me." "You're going to be fine?" I said, a little hopeful. "Will we be able to have kids?" "I'm sure there won't be any problems. Everything's working out for you here. Would a girl want to date a guy who could die of complications at any moment? How long have you been sick? No one knows. There's only one thing left to live for every day. That life is given to a person once and must be lived in such a way that there's no painful shame for the aimlessly lived years. We're all not eternal on earth, and what kind of... Here, everything's working fine for you. Would a girl want to date a guy who could die of complications at any moment? How long have you been sick? No one knows. There's only one thing left to live for every day as the last. After all, life is given to a person once, and it must be lived in such a way that there's no painful shame for the years lived without a purpose. All of us are not eternal on earth, and what kind of footprint we leave on it depends primarily on ourselves." The son fell silent in thought. Now I understand the questions that worry him more than bed sores, pains, and disorders. Apparently, Michael felt lost, not only to society, but also uninteresting to the girls. Such fears can eventually develop into neurosis. He needs a real hormonal release under the influence of wine or sudden surging emotions. But I decided I needed the way we act, and the footprint we leave on the world depends on us. The son fell silent in thought. Now I understand the questions that worry him more than bed sores, pains, and disorders. Apparently, Michael felt lost, not only to society, but also uninteresting to the girls. Such fears can eventually develop into neurosis. He needs a real hormonal release, under the influence of wine or sudden surging emotions. But I decided I needed to help myself. I had a son with a girlfriend, and he had no one else besides me. We may love each other to exhaustion. I fell down next to my son, whose face once could see delight and euphoria. In his eyes, there was a strange gleam. A few minutes later, I left him to take a shower. When I returned, my son was already sleeping peacefully, smiling sweetly in his sleep. I lay down next to him and thought about it. How could I ever have imagined? I was helping my son with his girlfriend, and I was the only one there with him. We were all tired, but I felt so happy. I fell asleep next to my son, and he looked so happy and relaxed. A few minutes later, I went to take a shower. When I came back, my son was already sleeping peacefully, smiling in his sleep. I lay down next to him and thought, how could I ever have imagined that I would study with my own son one day? It was impossible, and I couldn't even imagine it. But then, the impossible happened. I'm not ashamed. Other people, of course, will say that it was necessary to find some woman, but how many women will agree to make love to a disabled person who can easily be physically harmed? What do they know about the life of a disabled person? Did they turn their own son over every 2 to 3 years? I used to think that it was impossible for me to study with my son, but then it actually happened. I'm not ashamed. Other people might say it was necessary to find a woman, but how many women would agree to make love to a disabled person who could easily be physically harmed? What do they know about the life of a disabled person? Did they turn their own son over every 2 to 3 hours, day and night, despite his loud cries of pain and desperate resistance? If this isn't done, a bed sore will appear, the primary danger causing severe suffering and leading to death. Or they transferred a disabled person from a bed to a wheelchair and back several times every day, each time fearing to break his bones due to weak muscle tone. No, they don't dare judge me. I'm sure that only a loving woman he was crying out in pain and fighting back, but we couldn't stop. If we didn't, he could get a bed sore, which would be really bad. It could even kill him. They were transferring him from bed to wheelchair and back a lot every day, afraid of breaking his bones because of his weak muscles. I'm sure only a loving woman could handle this. His mom was the only one who could help him. I felt so much better after hearing that. I fell asleep the next morning. The son started doing therapeutic gymnastics, even though yesterday he didn't want to. I could see the same energy in his eyes. Yesterday, he was full of doubts and fears. But today, my son was fighting the disease so hard. His mom was able to help him deal with his problems. I was happy about that. I fell asleep that night. The next morning, the son started doing therapeutic gymnastics, even though yesterday he didn't want to. I could see the same energy in his eyes. Yesterday, he was full of doubts and fears, but now he was fighting the disease. I was surprised. Michael said it's better to try to do something than to just sit there and complain. I couldn't believe the change that had taken place, but I was also afraid that he might lose interest. I shouldn't have been afraid. After a few months of hard work, we started to see some results. I was surprised, but Michael explained that it's better to try to do something than to lie around and complain about life or feel sorry for yourself. I couldn't get enough of the change that had taken place, but at the same time, I was afraid that his impulse might also suddenly fade away. I shouldn't have been afraid. It was only after a few months of suffering, labor, and sweat that modest results began to be produced. The disease receded, and Michael began to move his fingers slowly, and then his arms and legs. A few months later, with my help, he got out of bed and took a few unsteady steps on crutches. Then he sat down on the bed, breathing heavily, but with a big smile on his face. He looked like the happiest man in the world. I smiled with him. Proud of my boy after the stormy events that took place on after his birthday, I was worried that my son would take everything wrong and that our relationship would be destroyed. I thought he would lock himself away and give up trying to improve his life. I wanted my son to have a girlfriend, but it seemed like there was no progress. Otherwise, he had really achieved great success. He was already able to move. He was moving around the room on his own, but it was pretty difficult and slow. Mom, I don't need any more help with making love, Michael suddenly said. I looked at him, surprised, and thought about the depression he'd had in the past. First, I can already do a lot on my own. The son replied with a smile. Second, I met a healthy girl. Where I was even more surprised when I did. How'd you get here? I asked, surprised. A month ago, he replied. You thought you forgot to turn off the iron in the apartment and left me outside for a while. I drove up to her in a wheelchair, and that's how we met. Her name's Amanda. She lives in the second entrance. Why didn't you tell me anything? I thought you wouldn't approve of my choice. I said reproachfully. She's a modest girl. I introduced her to you. She's a good girl. Get there. It happened a month ago. The son replied, then you thought that you forgot to turn off the iron in the apartment and left me outside for a while. I drove up to her in a wheelchair, and that's how we met. What's her name, Amanda? She lives in the second entrance. Why didn't you tell me anything? I'm sorry, but she's a modest girl, and I thought you wouldn't approve of my choice. I introduced her to you, and she's great. After talking frankly with my son, I found out that they were meeting in secret for me since we lived on the ground floor. Her son talked about her with such rapture that it was obvious that he had fallen in love. I was afraid that, due to his inexperience in communication, he perceived ordinary human signs of attention or pity from a girl as a manifestation of love. After all, my son has no experience dealing with girls. After a heart-to-heart with my son, I learned that they were meeting in secret for me since we lived on the ground floor. He talked about her with such excitement that it was clear he was head over heels. I was worried that, since he was new to all this, he'd think any attention or pity from a girl was love. After all, my son has no experience with girls. His mistake could lead to some pretty dramatic stuff. But when I met his girlfriend, Amanda, I realized I was wrong. The girl was actually pretty modest, charming, beautiful, and energetic. After we met, they started dating without hiding me. Michael dreamed of learning to dance, and Amanda helped him in every way she could. She was also very patient and kind. His mistake could have caused things to take a turn for the worse, but when I met his girlfriend, Amanda, I realized I was wrong. She was pretty, modest, charming, and energetic. After we met, they started dating without hiding me. Michael dreamed of learning to dance, and Amanda helped him in every way possible. She was also very patient and kind. The disease was rapidly receding. He could already walk with a stick, but even if he couldn't walk, it wouldn't have changed anything. They got married 6 months later, and they had a perfectly healthy baby girl. I was as happy as I've ever been that day, except for the day Michael was born. The doctor at the hospital was right. Michael's great desire to get better and my perseverance, optimism, and hard work played a role. He was doing really well, and he was even walking with a stick. But even if he couldn't walk, it wouldn't have changed anything. They got married 6 months later, and they had a perfectly healthy baby girl. I was as happy as I've ever been that day, except for the day Michael was born. The doctor at the hospital was right. My son's desire to get better and my perseverance, optimism, and hard work played a big role in his recovery. I hope my story will help you believe that even a very serious illness can be overcome. If you or someone close to you has a disease, don't give in to anxiety and uncertainty. You'll need all the mental strength, a clear mind, and will to deal with the danger that has arisen. No matter how scary the diagnosis may seem to you, never give in to despair and don't give up.